Well, hello, strangers. Another Tuesday, another true scary story. And this one is number 45.
This happened a few years back. As it involves someone else who got it a lot worse than I did, I'm going to keep the details vague and or altered to spare her stumbling across this and having any flashbacks. To start, I found my way to this internet forum because of an outdoor solo activity. Let's call it hobby board. And we'll say the hobby was hiking. It's close enough. It was a popular time in that activity, so the forum was booming. We were a tight-knit community. On the weekends, you'd see as many as 50 new posts a day, as the older, college-aged up to retiree crowd could use their weekend to indulge in their pastime. This made sense. People would post pictures of successful discoveries, scenic vistas, and even suggestions to any other forum member who may be close to their area and want to try their hand at that course, road, or trail. Don't get me wrong, there were plenty of joke posts in the forum, hobby board inside jokes, or people taking the piss in the usual way. It was early internet days, but it wasn't the majority of what was posted in our little forum. I found myself considering many of the usual posters as friends after a while, despite not knowing what they looked like, unless it got serious enough that people linked their other, non-anonymous social media. That's when I'd find that the forum member I'd taken for a college kid from his posts was revealed to be a spry grandpa. It's funny that way. Hobbyboard was a social media driven by writing in a vacuum, devoid of selfies or info that you'd use to categorize people at a surface level. It turned out you were really getting to know the person on a different, more personal level by not knowing what they looked like. Well, at least we thought we were. One day, one of the regular posters, I'll call him Tim, posted an announcement. To celebrate graduating from college, he was setting out on a cross-country, 2-month-long trip. He had a list of trails and sites he wanted to hit from our humble hobby board, as well as from other sites maintained by people in the hobby. He'd planned it out, saved up some for gas, food, and lodging, but it would still be expensive, and he was a college kid. So he put out there that if anyone had a spare room, he'd be interested in staying with folks from the hobby board and maybe having them along on nearby hunts. Plenty of folks volunteered a couch and home-cooked meals, and in the spirit of community, so did I. My home state was near the end of his planned journey. Tim reached out in private message, and we swapped contact information so we could know what to expect. He asked for my home address or a nearby public place if I wanted to vet him out first. I can hear people reading this story and thinking dox or it's a trap, and I get it. But Tim was a long-time poster on Hobbyboard. He not only had a consistent background, but also very real other social media. Better yet, he knew some of the other folks on Hobbyboard in real life, and they vouched for him too. Besides, I'm a dude in my 30s, physically fit, and I've always had good luck in life with friends. After so much time on the forums together, it felt like we knew each other. So, after checking him out, including a quiet search of his real name against online crime databases like Megan's Law, I was confident enough to send my home address to Tim, and Tim sent me the date he'd be in town. All was well. Tim set out on his trip and started posting his exploits to the board. His posts were long, humorous, and punctuated with pictures, as was the norm. I remember specifically some pictures from out in New Mexico. The reddish sand seemed impossibly saturated. When he had one stop before mine, I was eagerly checking out the forum, invested in charting his progress. But strangely, he didn't post. I figured maybe he was tired or busy. I did reach out in a PM to make sure he was still in touch. I was relieved when he replied an hour later. Still on course, just busy. And he planned to post his last exploit when he got to my place. Good deal. Tim rolled up that evening in his nondescript white sedan. He was as he appeared on his socials. He was friendly, a little arrogant, but so was I in truth. And Tim was as good a storyteller in person as he was on the forum. In trying to be thoughtful, the guy had spent weeks on the road at this point, and despite his patter, he was probably exhausted. I told him I was turning in early and offered him first crack at the shower so he could crash. It was an offer he gratefully took me up on. I heard him make his way straight to the spare room after. By the time I'd showered and wandered past the door to the guest room, he was out like a light. Any lingering doubts I'd had about him being a threat, or maybe playing the world's longest and most complicated con, were fruitless. Satisfied, I turned in myself. That night, I did wake up a lot, but I chalked that up to the excitement of being part of the adventure. The next morning, I awoke before Tim. I set about making coffee and breakfast. He appeared soon after, laid out the couple of trails he wanted to see, and off we went. I'd been to one of them already, so I was a good sport and sort of waited back while he took lead. He wanted to keep going, and I decided to let him explore a bit by himself. I returned to the truck. While waiting, I pulled up the forum on my phone. I guess he'd had trouble sleeping too. His forum post about his trip had been updated with his latest exploit, his stay with another forum member before me. His previous host was another longtime poster, one of the girls in our group that I'll call Diana. From what he posted, they'd had a great time. Tim made his way back to the truck, and we were off to the next trail, a newer one I hadn't tried out yet. He must have seen my phone out, as he started to tell me about his last stop, and how nice Diana had been. I said something like I was glad, that I knew it could be sketchy meeting people from the internet, but our humble little forum was apparently checking out as one of the rare exceptions. He readily agreed, saying everyone had been nice, and Diana herself hospitable. He said that phrase in sort of a locker room talk kind of way. We weren't close mates, and again, he was about 10 years younger than I, so I wasn't exactly wanting to hear about that kind of thing. Well, I just thought to myself, kids these days, and what I said in response was something like, cool, but I hoped he wasn't expecting that sort of hospitality from me. He laughed, but he didn't take the hint. He sort of kept bringing her up. He mentioned a few other forum people with whom he'd stayed, implying he'd hooked up with them too, but he really kept circling back around to Diana. I just took it as that arrogance I'd picked up on the previous night, didn't comment, and hoped he'd drop it before it got weird. We got to the next trail. Had fun. Stopped for burgers. All told, we spent the entire day in each other's company. Thus, a very large part of time was spent talking. But on the way back to my house, he went from Sir Talks-a-Lot to very distracted by his phone. I was driving, but even from a few glances I could see his face registering something off. I asked him if everything was okay. He jerked his phone to the side as though I'd been able to read its screen and drive. I hadn't, but the motion was abrupt enough that I figured out that's what he thought. He told me it was nothing. I mean, from his sudden mood change, it clearly wasn't nothing, but I didn't know him well enough to push it further. We made it back to my house all right, milled around in the living room for a while, then traded off taking showers. All that hiking around in the summer heat had us both smelling not unlike the grilled onions in our burgers. As I was dumping my clothes in the hamper, I noticed a smear of French fry oil and ketchup on my light-colored pants and cursed, knowing that that was likely a permanent stain and well set in. At this curse, Tim's neck snapped in my direction. With a small, nervous edge, he asked me what was wrong. I looked over at him. His anxiety made my own nerves jangle a bit. I pushed a laugh, told him I'd gotten grease on my new pants, hoped that I hadn't ruined them. Then I asked him again if everything was all right. He looked relieved and very quickly answered all was well, but it wasn't. Something was obviously up, but also obviously he did not want to talk about it either. It's a weird place to be in, having a whole day around a person, having them stay in your house, but not feeling like you're close enough to ask what's wrong and get a real answer. I decided to mind my own business, but it took some conscious effort. I asked him if he wanted to watch some TV, and he again was game, seeming to calm down again. I forget what was on, but after the day of having the sun beating down on us, I was near dozing. So I told him he was welcome to keep watching, but that I was racking out for the night. He turned to me suddenly and told me, "Hey, probably I'm not going to update the forum tonight." I didn't quite understand what he'd said. It was sort of out of nowhere, so I asked, "Do what?" He paused, looked at me. His face was unreadable, but his eyes kept darting about. He told me, never mind, he was tired. He just wanted to let me know he wouldn't be updating the forum tonight, so not to stay up waiting on him to post. I didn't really know what to say about that. It hadn't crossed my mind to check the forum at all, so I just told him okay and I'd see him the next morning. And that was it. I wandered off to the bed and promptly fell asleep, waking at 6 a.m. the following morning by habit. The house was quiet. Not wanting to get up and risk waking my guest, who knew when he'd gone to bed, I reached over to my nightstand and grabbed my phone. Out of habit, I opened a browser and checked the forum. There were new posts on a few of the message threads that I followed, to include Tim's trip. I hesitated, remembering his jumpiness the night before. Had he not wanted me to read it? It seemed kind of like it. Well, I knew he wasn't going to have updated it yet, so I just decided to wait. Probably just some fellow enthusiasts derailing or posting inside joke stuff anyway. I looked around at the wonders of online time wasters for about an hour, then decided to get up and make coffee. As I did, I looked down the hall at the spare room door. It was shut, but I could hear Tim moving around in there. I quietly made a pot of coffee, and Tim emerged, looking haggard. I asked him if he was all right. He shook his head, face puffy and hooded, and told me he hadn't slept well. But under the sleepy lids, his eyes burned bright, wary. Even with all of my previous thought, he was just worn out. He'd been on the road for nearly 2 months. He and I had spent a day together and nothing seemed off. Something was starting to weird me out about Tim. But what could I even do? He was leaving that morning to hit his penultimate stop. We knew each other from a few interactions online, and one day of hitting the trails. Frankly, I couldn't really know if this was off for him, or just normal behavior. Maybe he wasn't a morning person. I made some toast for us both and kept up a light patter of small talk. He eased again, telling me I'd made the right choice in not pressing the issue. Not long after breakfast, he packed up his rucksack. We shook hands on the porch as he made to leave. He paused again. He looked at my face one last time. Then, looking down, he pressed his lips together, said thanks again, and was off the porch and on to the next place. I stood and watched him leave, then retreated inside myself. His edgy mood rubbed off on me. I had a hard time the rest of the day settling down to do anything focused. I made myself wait until the next day to read the forum thread. I finally flicked it open during my lunch hour at work. The thread had been plugging along at about a dozen replies a day, but after not looking at it over the weekend, it had ramped up. It had over 100 replies to the thread to read from the last post I'd seen. As I assumed, the posts immediately following the stop before Tim stayed with me were general replies, jokes, just forum chatter. But then, I read something that made my sandwich ball up in my suddenly dry throat and near choke me, like someone changing the channel in the middle of a movie. Another poster dropped a one-sentence bomb about how they knew what he'd done and how he was disgusting. A couple of posts went by like they hadn't seen this. Likely, even in its glory days, the forum was notoriously cranky and could delay showing replies to a thread. But then someone replied to that post with confused emojis. Then another asked if it was a troll. The poster came back, apologetic that they couldn't say more, as it would be outing a victim, but to please go on and ask Tim himself, since he already confirmed it. The very next post was Tim, and instead of defending himself, Tim simply said he'd had it coming. I know the forum was part of the old Web 1.0, and all the old things must die eventually. But in some ways, I do think it had its benefits. If it had been one of those social medias where you could like a post, some algorithm might have squelched what was to come, burying the sudden, accusatory posts from the obviously well-liked Tim's content. For Diana's sake, I'm glad it wasn't. What followed, stretched across a dozen or so posts, was a story. The story of what had actually happened when Tim had stayed with Diana. That he didn't just take advantage of people's trust, getting to stay in forum members' homes and eat their food for nothing. That he'd taken even more, and how jail was too good for what he'd done. More chimed in, seeming to confirm the clue that whatever Tim had done, he'd done to someone on this board who'd hosted him. But this poster underlined the charges clearer, about how he'd always been banging on in different boards, being creepy, always talking up how he had so much luck with the ladies. I checked my watch. Lunch was over, so I shuffled back off to my work, not sure of what to make of any of what I've read. But as I started to put my phone back in my pocket, it rang in my hand. I checked the caller. It was Tim. He told me he'd not made the trip out of town yet. The day before, after leaving my place, he'd taken ill. He'd stayed in a hotel last night. He totally understood if my answer was a no, but could he possibly stay at mine for another night before heading homeward? I was conflicted. On the one hand, that sudden, dark turn on the forum was clanging around in my brain like a moth dementedly throwing itself at a porch light. But on the other, some random accusations with no proof weren't exactly something I could hold against the man. Were they? Would that be fair? It was a hard think for a few moments, but finally, I decided to accept him as a guest for one more night. I checked with my boss. It was a slow day, and he let me clock out early so I could go home and see to my surprise house guest. I drove home, and Tim arrived shortly after. Tim seemed run down and ended up taking his leave from dinner early to rest and hopefully recover. Well, no better time to see what the other 90 posts were on about. But when I checked the thread, it had leapt to 154 new posts. There were a few more posts from forum posters stating my thoughts, enough hinting what exactly had he done. What were they accusing Tim of doing? The reply was swift, reposting a post that Tim himself had made on another thread within the forum. The post was about dating and relationships. It wasn't a thread I'd frequented, as it just seemed to be guys bragging about their sexual escapades. Since I'm not a 14-year-old high on hormones, I found it eye-rollingly gross. But here was my house guest, going into detail about how everything had been going so well, going from PG to PG-13 to R-rated, with a sudden snap at the end. From his description, and what I knew from her posts, he was describing Diana. His post was too long to reprint, and given what came out about it, it's not something I'm going to repeat. But in essence, he described her as having been receptive to many events he described as playful flirting. But even with his heavy, arrogant bias, I felt sick to my stomach reading past the cutesy anecdotes. There were a lot of places where Tim recalled Diana expressing she wasn't into it, being nice but saying to stop. I felt like the world was going all uneven under me. Tim had added things like she was smiling when she said it, and it was her house, as though she'd have to threaten to call the cops or something. Christ. At one point, she'd told him no, that she didn't want to go further, and his response? To, quote-unquote, playfully pants her, stripping her naked. I leaned back in my chair. What the hell did I just read? I turned, meaning to go get some water to clear a sudden awful taste from my mouth, and nearly jumped out of my skin. In the reflection of a picture on my desk, I saw the doorway directly behind me. Tim was standing in it, silently watching me. Thinking quickly, I turned the move into an elaborate yawn and stretch, then fully turned my chair to face the doorway, preparing a less fearful response to his sudden appearance. But by the time I turned around, the doorway was empty. It did not set my mind at ease, but I continued my act, being as overtly loud and obvious as possible. I'd clearly seen what he hadn't wanted me to see. I had to play it cool for my own sake. So I wandered through the house. I made as much noise as I could, getting a glass out and drinking water with satisfied gulps. As I did, I heard a new sound, my front door closing. I went to the front room of my house and looked through the window that opened to the porch. I saw Tim's retreating back, but he paused. Before walking to his car, he turned and looked directly back at me through the window for a long moment. His expression was hard to read. Anger, yes, but underneath it, wild fear. Then he turned, walked to his car, and was gone. After locking the door, I returned to my office to finish the original thread. The forum had erupted in the post count I'd seen. Many posters were heaping on insults, telling Diana to turn him in. Again, I won't repeat exactly what was said, but one post summed it up well. Your demand that someone needed to be clearer in saying no the approximately 20 times she said no is excellent advice for when you go to prison actually. 10 out of 10 great tip. Let us know how it goes for you in the showers. You can imagine where the thread went from there. I have no idea what came of this event. While I knew some of the posters, I wasn't best buds with Diana or any of them, and even asking what happened felt gross to me. But I was able to infer that Diana had indeed engaged with the local authorities at some point. Good for her, I'd say. I have no idea what came of any of this. The forums had been losing their luster for me for a while, but this seemed to put the final nail in the coffin. I met some good people there, but between you and me, I don't think I'd ever let any of them stay over again.
Have fun out there, guys, but be careful. Be careful of who you let into your circle, And definitely be careful of who you let into your house. Like, comment, subscribe, any mix you please. And thank you so much for spending time with me today. Until next time, take care, strangers.